The truth of the matter is, I am a Black woman that grew up in the Deep South. White supremacy was a threat, to not only our livelihood, but our lives.
Coming in and seeing what I've seen this morning, it puts me back in touch of my own purpose. It re-quickened my reality that the movement has to go on. It cannot stop.
I think it's extremely important to know the history and the background, to know the facts, where we came from and what we did, and so that way we could change it and make a difference. It was definitely an eye-opener, especially coming from a white person.
This is for the ones who can no longer sing for themselves, for George Jackson and George Floyd, for Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn and Breonna.
I got the history, I got the point. However, it made me do a self-reflection. Am I doing enough for my people? Am I doing enough for my community? Because change starts with you.
The legacy of the civil rights movement is what teaches us how we need to go about actually getting the rights that we deserve. Because they started the fight, because they ignited the fire, we're able to continue that fight, and maybe it won't be so long for us.
The civil rights movement will never end, right? Until the world is just, there will always be a movement.
This museum is very empowering, it's very encouraging to everyone that comes here, and they see the messages, they see the pictures that just make you believe that you can do anything.
I believe that when all of us take the time to really just lean into the possibilities that exist, when people can tap into their humanity, that's when change happens.
We want people to feel like that we're in a critical juncture, that we've got the ability to make history.
Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King modeled what it meant to face fear head on. My responsibility of carrying on that legacy is to ensure that we keep that torch lit and never let that light die out.
Welcome to Southern Poverty Law Center's Civil Rights Memorial Center's book conversation and discussion with Efrén C. Olivares. I am so excited to have my colleague here with me tonight, being moderated by Lecia Brooks, our Chief of Staff and Culture. So thank you all for those of you who are here in person and in the flesh. And thank you to all of those who are tuned in live streaming this event. This will be definitely an important conversation, and I think you will find this very interesting, a lot of similarities, and also a discussion that is critical for the time that we're in our country. So I'll introduce our special guest first, Efrén C. Olivares. He's the Deputy Legal Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Immigrant Justice Project. This project focuses on ending immigrant detention, including through its Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative, a program that provides pro bono legal services to detained immigrants at immigration detention centers in the Deep South. Efrén is an accomplished attorney, a civil rights lawyer. He's represented clients both in federal courts and international human rights for over a decade. He previously directed the Racial and Economic Justice Program, which is now Beyond Borders, at the Texas Civil Rights Project, serving as the lead attorney in a landmark petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in which he represented families separated under the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy. His writings on immigration policy have been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, and Newsweek. He's also testified before Congress and at Capitol Hill briefings. I had the pleasure of hearing Efrén in person during the pandemic, which was a virtual event. It was an intimate conversation, and he shared parts of his life. And I found his conversation just profound. And he speaks with so much passion and dedication and commitment to this cause. And in preparation for this event, I just Googled him just a little bit more. And there was this podcast, You Have to Do More Than Preach, that he was featured on in 2019. So tonight we are honored to have him here to discuss his memoir, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines, which was published in 2022. Please help me welcome Efrén C. Olivares. And next, I will introduce our fearless Chief of Staff and Culture for the Southern Poverty Law Center, Lecia J. Brooks. Lecia is currently serving as our Chief of Staff, but previously served as the Director of Outreach for Southern Poverty Law Center. And also, she actually was the first director of the Civil Rights Memorial Center, who saw it from its design through its implementation. And she has definitely left a legacy for this space that you're in tonight. Lecia is currently focused on building an anti-racist workplace culture across all of our offices located in the Deep South and ensuring a continued focus on equity. As I said, she has served as the outreach director, and she traveled across the country speaking about hate and extremism in this country. She also serves on the board of Western State Center, where she serves as the board secretary and treasurer. Now, this organization works nationwide to build a future where all people can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear. So please join me in welcoming Lecia J. Brooks, our moderator for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Tafeni. Well, thank you. I'm just a little fangirl tonight, and Efrén, I'm just honored to sit with you and discuss your book. Thank you so much for allowing us to do this. You're a dear colleague, and I hope that you feel the love from all your colleagues at the Southern Poverty Law Center tonight. So thank you for being with us. And thank you all for being with us tonight at the Civil Rights Memorial Center and joining us by live stream. And it's my great hope that if you haven't read the book, that our conversation tonight will inspire you to go out and get it. It's quite moving. Efrén, I'm going to start with the whole notion of this being a memoir. My Boy Will Die of Sorrow is a memoir, but it doesn't just tell your story. It tells the story of others and their immigrant experience, many of which were very heartbreaking. What motivated you to write this story now? I mean, you're quite young to write a memoir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Lecia, for moderating. Thank you, Tafeni, for hosting. And thank you to all of my colleagues at SPLC, Catherine, and our entire comms team and digital team that made this possible. It really feels good to be at home to talk about this book and some of the work. Why did I write this memoir? In May of 2018, I walked into a federal courtroom in McAllen, Texas, about 6 miles from the border. And I had been in that building many times before for a variety of civil rights cases, but I had never seen the courtroom like this. It was packed. The wooden benches typically reserved for observers were jam-packed with men and women of all ages, handcuffed, shackled, looking tired, sleep-deprived, wearing clothes that had probably been worn for too long. The public defenders were getting ready to start the hearing. All of these men and women were immigrants. They had crossed the border a day or two prior, and they were being charged with a misdemeanor crime. Federal misdemeanor that carries the same penalty as running a stop sign at the Pentagon. Crossing the border without authorization, technically crossing the border between ports of entry, a law that has been in the books since the 1920s, so nothing new. And historically, prosecutors had discretion to charge people or not. They would not charge some, and those people would be referred to the immigration authorities without this crime prosecution. But a few weeks prior, the Attorney General, hailing from the state of Alabama, Mr. Sessions, had announced a new policy, the zero tolerance policy, which mandated 100% of prosecutions. So everybody who crossed the border without authorization would be prosecuted. And critically, he made the announcement that anybody traveling with a child would be separated from a child. If you don't want to be separated from your child, don't bring them across the border. That was the sentence he said on the press conference. And a day before, I had received a phone call from one of the federal public defenders telling me what she was hearing from her clients, that they had been traveling with a son or a daughter, and they hadn't seen them in a couple of days, and they didn't know where they were, when they might see them again, who was caring for them, no information. And here I was, 10 years out of law school, still a true believer, impressionable lawyer. That can't be. It just can't be that in 2018 in the United States of America, you're taking people's children without any process at all, without any documentation, let alone due process. That just can't be. Let me see if I can confirm that. And in fact, that's what the parents told us. That morning, there were 5 parents who had been separated from their children in court. And over the next several weeks, we ended up representing nearly 400 separated parents in one courthouse alone along the border. There are 19 courthouses along the border. And you all probably remember the headlines from that summer. The cruelty, deterrence being the objective, trying to dissuade would-be immigrants from coming. What I did not think at the time, and it would take me many months to reflect on, is that but for a couple of decades, I could have been one of those children. When I was 9 years old, I was in Mexico, growing in Mexico, and for the first 9 years of my life was going to be in Mexico. When at the age of 9, my father couldn't find work, so he moved to Texas in search of work, while my mother, my siblings, and I stayed behind. And for the next 4 years, we saw him only occasionally when he would visit for a week and a month or so. And I didn't think of that as particularly hard for me. When you're 9, 10, 11 years old, it is what it is. It's kind of the hand that life deals you. My friends' parents would go to work and come back in the evening. My dad would come back 3 weeks later. But with the passage of time, I realized how critical those 4 years were for who I ended up becoming, my identity as an immigrant, as an advocate and a lawyer, and how hard it was not to have my dad around at the dinner table, not to have him around for significant school milestones or a medical emergency. And once I started seeing those parallels, that's where the idea for the book came from. And I want to be clear, I was one of the lucky ones. I don't want to compare my experience with that of my clients, my former clients. Some would say that we chose to be separated or be apart from my father, whereas what the separated families under zero tolerance went through was torture, was violent, and completely unnecessary. But my own upbringing and knowing what it's like to pick up and leave and start over in a new country where you don't know the language, where you don't know the culture, leaving behind family and community, that ended up being the common thread that I look at in my book, as well as the history of immigration law and policy, right? Was 2018 really an anomaly? Or was that the latest and most easily shared incident of that kind of treatment of immigrant families at the border?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And that's just the first couple of chapters, really. And one of the things that I really appreciate you talking about, you really give us a clear picture of the inhumanity of our justice system and how people are treated. One of the things that I noticed is that you felt like you intentionally named people, those first clients. I remember reading about when you got the call and you rushed over there and thought we're going to meet with parents, and you had a very few minutes to do so, but you took the time to name every person, and that I really, really appreciated that. It brought me closer to the story, closer to the person, and it gave me a sense of who you are, who you were even then. So thank you for that. And I do appreciate the connection that you're making with the stories that you share of the folks that you helped. And I came to understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but would you agree that your immigration story really started when your father left and you were, younger? So I remember reading you had a full life, a full childhood. It was very happy, and not that it turned sad. It would seem like people, families. You figure things out, you work it out. But I did sense a loss, a longing or a missing. So a missing of something. Your family, your father was gone from the family, and so I think that what we don't think about is that. What about the people who are left behind? Like when your father immigrated. Of course, families don't migrate together, and some may decide not to migrate at all. What impact did that have on your family, and you think other families who are similarly situated?
A lot of the memories that I share in the book are things that I thought about as they were happening, and some of them are things that I didn't reflect upon until many years later. Some of them only when I was writing the book. And that one of those is what it must have been like for my mother to stay behind with a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old son and trying to make ends meet in between visits from my father. And she was quite literally, I was thinking on the drive over here, for those 4 years, she was pretty much a single mom. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I never thought of that in those terms. And we hear a lot about the sacrifices of folks who make the journey to the U.S., and that is very difficult and risking their life, etc. But we don't hear a lot about the people who stay behind and the sacrifices that they make and how not having whoever it is that left around, how that affects their life. Since the book came out, I've heard from friends, acquaintances, even colleagues here at SPLC who have told me, like, you know what? I never thought of what happened to me as a family separation, but I was supposed to not see my mom for 2 weeks, and then this or that happened, and it became 4 years. It's extremely common in the immigrant experience. I'm learning and kind of validating some of the stories in the book to have some separation, because migration, by definition, is a separation from something. You leave a home, a community, a country, perhaps, but it's very commonly also a separation from someone. It may not always be a father or a mother or a child, but a loved one, a close relative is often one is separated from, so that a separation is now, I am convinced, almost inherent to the immigrant experience. When it comes to my mom in particular, there's an excerpt that I would like to read that speaks to kind of what she would do when my dad wasn't around, and how she made sure that my younger brother and I had as happy a childhood as possible. And in this part of the book, it's in the early chapters, and I'm discussing how in some ways it wasn't clear whether my dad had left or not. Some of his clothes were around, his tools, his garden tools were around, his shoes, but he wasn't there. So it was like, is he gone or is he not gone? That he was indeed gone was most noticeable in the evenings when my mother tried to bolster our spirits by making what she pronounced was our favorite dinner dish, parecitos de manteca, little pears of beef tallow. These pears were a simple yet delicious concoction. Take 2 tortillas, rub some beef tallow on each of them, maybe get lucky and include a few tiny crumbs of beef that sank to the bottom when the broth was separated from the tallow. Pair them together and then warm them up in the comal, a thin griddle used to cook and warm tortillas. Be sure not to leave them on for too long, because the tortillas might get toasted, becoming hard and crispy, and no one wants that. They are meant to be rolled into a long and tight taquito, evenly distributing the grease. The tallow should be fully melted and the tortillas piping hot, but still soft enough to be able to roll them. Sometimes the tallow would fall out of the tortilla into the comal, releasing a hiss of steam and a wonderful smell that tempted my brother and me as we waited, shirtless, seated at the round kitchen table. We dined on these little pieces of heaven a couple of times a week, and some weeks more often, when my dad hadn't come home for a while. On the rare weekends when he visited, bringing chicken and bread and bologna for sandwiches, my mom did not need to get as creative in the kitchen.
Thank you. You really do get a sense of your family and a sense that love can continue to live there. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. As you talk about the connection that you're now recognizing in terms of your immigrant experience and your experience with separation, you may not have thought about it that first day when you went to the courthouse in Texas. What do you remember like feeling beyond just amazement that it was happening? Did you feel an instant connection with the clients that you met? And how was it to hear their stories and go from one person to the next person? Because that is so not you, one. So how was that for you?
I would say if I had to capture it in one word, it was disbelief. Just, it was unfathomable that this was happening. And now that, we're 4 years away from that, but try to put yourself back in May and June of 2018, when we didn't know how long this policy was going to be going on for. There was zero plans to reunite families. Our greatest fear was that parents would be deported and the children stayed in the U.S., and that happened to a lot of families. So it was a scramble. It was it's a blur of caffeine and adrenaline, trying to document, that this child was traveling with this parent, because the government was not keeping track of that. Children, unaccompanied children who, anyone under 18 who crosses the border without a parent or a guardian is transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, an agency within the Health and Human Services Department. So after the separation, children were being sent to ORR, but in their files, there was no notation that they had been traveling with a parent. So it was then impossible for ORR to distinguish between a 17-year-old who truly crossed the border alone from a 17-year-old who had been separated from a parent, because it wasn't noted on the file. So documenting that became so critical to make so that we could, one, document that that family had been traveling together, and then try to find the children and reunite them. First, try to arrange a phone call. And the first few days and the early weeks, it was so difficult, right? Depending on how many families were separated, how much time we had to talk to them. The first day we got lucky, there were 5, and 30 minutes we were interviewing them. Other days it was 12, 15. Then they started having morning shift of prosecutions and afternoon shifts. 10, 20, 25. One day alone there were 35 separated parents, right? So at that point, it became impossible to hear anything about their story or their life. It's like name, date of birth, country of origin, and the same for the children. That was the critical information. And that is the part of the evil nature of the machine, right? In robbing me of the opportunity to really get to know my clients. Who are they? I have no idea who any of them were, and many of them I never saw again. Just a name, a date of birth, and that's it. But that is built into our system, into our immigration system, that is very much designed to exclude certain immigrants, not to protect, not even to process immigrants. And I'm happy to talk more about that. And as time went by, I remember finding myself desensitized, hearing horrible things from the mothers and the fathers, and just not blinking. Just, okay, their birth, next thing. And
I didn't feel it like, I didn't experience it that way. I hear what you're saying. It felt like you recognized pretty quickly that you had to get certain information, that certain information was critical to the outcome of the case for your client. So you did seem focused on getting that, but you also felt still connected to them and their humanity, but you knew you had to get this critical piece of information. Tell us about what that information is and why it was important.
Well, when the separations were happening and the children were being sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that critical information was the only way we were able to reconnect the parents with their children. Often we would hear from the case managers at ORR that they couldn't give us any more information because for the safety of the children, right? Very strict protocols and bureaucratic hurdles that prevented us from making contact with the children on behalf of the parents, even though we had proved that we were representing the parents. And this desensitization, when I realized it, I was like, what is this doing to me? Like, what am I becoming? That's not normal. These stories should have an impact on me, these details. And so that's when I stepped back, because I realized what this vicarious trauma was starting to do to me. But again, we had this imperative of we need to do this. We need to get this information. Otherwise, some of these families are going to be lost forever in the bureaucratic process.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Efrén, I mean, what an experience. One of the many things that stood out for me is that you're talking about the legal tools that were made available and not made available. I mean, you're seeking justice for families. I mean, these are people, right? Parents and their children. I mean, it can't get more base and serious than that. Could you share with us some creative strategies that you found you had to use in service of your clients to reunify the families?
Yeah, for the lawyers watching or here in the room, we early on considered a TRO, right? A temporary restraining order, going to the local federal court to try to stop the policy. There was already a lawsuit in California that the ACLU and others had filed months prior, before zero tolerance was announced, because separations had started happening already at the end of 2017. And we were in McAllen, Texas, considering our options. And the challenge, part of the challenge was that in the criminal prosecution, right, these parents had crossed the border between ports of entry, crossed through a river. So it was, that's the definition of the crime. So it was hard to argue that they weren't guilty of the crime. So that presented a challenge in the criminal law context. In the immigration law context, they didn't have a visa and they didn't have a claim to US citizenship. So they were facing likely deportation unless they had a credible asylum claim. But it was hard to challenge that they were being, that the immigration process itself was also problematic. But at a very visceral level, taking somebody's child, taking a child's parent from them, it was both ways, right? Look at it from both perspectives. It just got to you that cannot be right. So from the international human rights perspective, where the guiding principle is the best interest of the child, governments, including the United States government, have committed to, when adopting policies that impact children, that policy has to abide by the principle of the best interest of the child. So in that space, in the international human rights space, it was almost a slam dunk. So we opted to go that route, kind of skip the US court system, go to the Inter-American human rights system, and filed an emergency request for precautionary measures. My original idea was, okay, first day we had 5. We'll come tomorrow, and then we'll amend and add to the next 5 tomorrow. And then on Monday, we'll add some more, and so on and so forth, to show the urgency and the magnitude of the problem. But after we filed it, we realized that had we done that, our petition would still be pending probably today, because the commission would have had to evaluate the impact on the families that we named. So we decided to go ahead with the first 5 only, but used that legal vehicle as a tool to advocate in the nightly news, through op-eds, in interviews, in every way we could against the policy, right? To share the stories that we were hearing from our clients, from the parents, with their consent, because that was another trick, right? We are always respectful when it comes to children particularly, right? Of the consent of the impacted person, of our client. We can only share the story if they give their consent, and we did so anonymously. Some of them was like, you can use my name. I don't care. I'm happy to do this. This is not right. So in those cases, we would use names. In the book, I use pseudonyms unless they gave their consent to use their name. And that became a nightly routine, just interviews, sharing the stories of the days, of the day, until eventually the tide turned and we were able to stop this policy. And then our human rights complaint was successful. It was granted. The lawsuit in California was eventually successful as well, and even the administration had to change course and did not fully stop the separations, but significantly reduce the number of people who were being separated.
Thank you for that, and I do recall, like, and you had to bring all those tools to bear, especially kind of those communication strategies where you get the word out and show people what is happening in an attempt to, get at people's conscience and have them kind of help you help your clients. I had the opportunity once to go to a detention court in Arizona. It was the same kind of thing. I've never experienced anything this awful in my life. It was terrible. And if every U.S. citizen could experience something like that, it was just as you described, but I experienced it even worse. Because they brought everyone in and everyone was chained and shackled together like a chain gang. It was a huge courthouse, and they filled every row. I mean, in every side, it was packed. They had 5 microphones up at the front, and they just walked people. I was just observing, and I thought I was gonna like lose it. It was just the most dehumanizing thing that I've ever seen, and that I think you talk about, and I'll stop talking about myself and let you talk. But you alluded to the history, the U.S.'s history with immigration, and how we can be really, really cruel. And I often hear people talk about it in terms of our policymakers, or, the U.S. government is doing this, but it really is, it's us, right? I mean, we are the U.S., we are the U.S. So what have you learned, and what are you sharing in the book about kind of that history, and what did you learn as you dug into it even more about the U.S.'s history around immigration?
Yeah, this policy was definitely done in our name.
Mm-hmm.
It was very common to hear that summer from people who were opposed to the policy, including some of my colleagues and partners, this is not who we are as a country.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the US. This is not American values. So when I started writing the book, I did some research into the history of immigration law and policy, and to try to find out how immigrant families, immigrant children have been treated in the US when trying to come to our borders. And for the first 150 years or so of the United States history, there was no federal immigration law.
Mm.
Nothing, what some might describe as open borders. Anyone who wanted to come could come. In the 1870s, the first restrictions were imposed, and then in the early 1880s, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted. To this day, the only law that has a nationality and ethnicity explicitly named in its title for exclusion. And the motivation for that exclusion was that Chinese people coming to California were bringing disease, were dirty, were criminals. And it was explicitly in the legislative history of that law. In the early 1900s, with the influx of Irish refugees, Italian refugees, Jewish refugees, you had the same backlash that led to the creation of Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco, where children were put in hurricane fence cages, much like we saw in 2018, with the same reasoning, right? These races don't mix well with the Caucasian race. They're gonna dirty our race. And that backlash led to the passage of the National Origins Act in 1924, which was a law that set up quotas for every country around the world of who could immigrate to the US. And over 85% of the quotas were designated to Northern European countries, predominantly white countries.
85%?
85% of the quotas. That same year, 1924, was when the Border Patrol was founded to enforce those quotas. World War II, you had Japanese and Japanese Americans, US citizens and immigrants alike, sent to internment camps, and family separations happened routinely in that process. There was no concern for family unity in that process. And the reasons you hear for those policies, for the National Origins Act in 1924, are the same that we hear today, except on top of they're bringing disease, they're going to cause crime, they're going to take your jobs, they're dangerous to your families. On top of that, you had the eugenics argument, right? The racist argument, including from President Wilson at the time, that they would not mix well with the great race. Now, I share all of that, not to chastise United States history, but I think it's also important not to sanitize it, not to romanticize it, to face it for what it is. So while, when you hear we're a nation of immigrants, well, we are. I mean, a lot of us, the majority of us in this country, either us or our ancestors, came from elsewhere. In the case of Black Americans, they're not, immigrants in the conventional sense. Their ancestors were brought here against their will. But other than that, we moved across the earth. And humankind, we've been moving across the earth in search of two things for thousands of years: protection, safety, or opportunity. It's the most human thing to do. It's what defines us. So why is it that when you look at those who did it before, they're pioneers, and we put them on a pedestal, but those coming in today are looking for a handout, and they're criminals? It's inescapable that the darker your skin color in this country, the worse you fare in the immigration system. That is the sad reality, When Ukrainian asylum seekers showed up at the southern border, somehow our immigration authorities managed to process thousands of them. Over 20,000 Ukrainian asylum seekers were processed and admitted into the US. And I'm glad that happened because they needed it. They were escaping horrendous things, but so were Haitian asylum seekers. And how did we receive them? On horseback and with a whip.
Right.
So the racist origins of our immigration laws and agencies is not something of the past or of 100 years ago. It's something very much of today, regardless of who's in power.
That's very, very powerful history, and we need to reckon with it because it's just as you say. I mean, it's always been racialized. I'm gonna have to sit with that for a moment. Oh, sorry. There's something else there, and this ties to what you were just speaking about in terms of the seeming kind of opposites in that we're a nation of immigrants, and no, we don't want your kind. There's long been this tension. What can we do with respect to immigration law? Because as I understand it, you're pointing out in your book, the notion that immigration law has been and still is about deterrence and not about protection. I wondered, because I don't want to just assume, deterring people from coming, is that what you mean? And protecting who? Are we looking to protect immigrants from what they might be escaping in terms of violence or need, or is it about protecting U.S. citizens?
Yeah, it's a tension of multiple interests and priorities, right? The foundation of our immigration agencies, of our immigration laws, is deterrence and exclusion of certain kinds of immigrants. No families were separated at the northern border. No European families were separated, and I'm glad that didn't happen. And the idea of protection for us, people fleeing violence and persecution. I mean, the latest iteration with Venezuelan asylum seekers, that now they're being expelled when they're fleeing a repressive regime in Venezuela, looking for a democratic home, right? And our laws on paper protect that and create a haven for people to come here, and regardless of how they enter the country, by the way, and be able to apply for asylum and be processed. And if they have a meritorious claim, have a home here. But we have come so far from that in practice with how we are treating people that the immigration system just becomes about excluding people.
I see.
And there's also this tension that you will hear often from business leaders of, the border between the US and Mexico is the longest land border between a rich industrialized country and a developing poor country in the world. So the demand for inexpensive labor on the US side and the supply of inexpensive labor on the Mexican side is a reality that unless we address that, we're always going to have this tension. No matter how tall a wall we build, no matter what the policies are, that inescapable forces, economic forces, putting that pressure. There's right now a shortage of workers in the US. And we're expelling people by the thousands at the border. What gives? Other than skin color, when you look at it beyond the surface.
Do you see any other country doing this right?
We've done it right for goods and services. We figured it out. we have free trade agreements, and we've allowed goods and services to flow across borders freely, pretty much freely, but not people. Not people, because of, in my opinion, these outdated notions of who has the right to the land, right? That's where this notion of the great replacement theory comes from, right? This idea that immigrants or others are replacing certain people, white people in the US, as if white people have an unassailable right to this land, right? Those of us who believe in a multiracial democracy, as long as you abide by the principles that we have organized our society under, you can become an American. And it used to be the case that was the talking point from elected officials. Not anymore. Only certain people are welcome.
I need some hope here, Efrén. Let's talk about, let's go to you, because you're very hopeful. You're also, in fact, you're compassionate, you have empathy, you have hope. How do you hold on to your compassion and your hope?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, right? And I guess that that allows me to keep doing this work even in difficult circumstances. But I continue to believe in the promise, right, of this country, of human rights, in trying to push ourselves, our society, our leaders, our elected leaders, our institutions to get closer to that ideal. And if I didn't believe in that possibility, in that dream, then I don't think I would be able to do that. And the last several years have been particularly hard. But one mindset shift that has made it more sustainable for me, when I'll speak for myself. When I was in law school, you think of winning that big case. In front of the court, whatever, pick your court, and you have that big argument, or in front of a jury, and you win, and you sort of get it to the finish line. And that feels so far away right now. So difficult. That's like, can I keep doing this work for another 10, 20, 30 years? But the mindset shift is like, my job, I don't see my job as getting to the finish line. My job is to keep pushing this ball and making sure that if it rolls back, it doesn't roll back too far. Just keep pushing it so that those who are coming behind me can get it to the finish line. It's a little depressing, I'll admit, because I may not see the ball across the finish line, but that makes it sustainable. If my role is to just keep pushing, right? Keep pushing us, keep pushing whoever is in power to live up to the ideals, not only of our Constitution, but of broader human rights, of humanity and respect for people, regardless of place of birth or language or skin color. I can do that. So that allows me to dream a little bit of a better tomorrow for my children, for myself, right? I also want to see the victories in my lifetime, and I believe some victories are achievable. Some others, it will be for other generations, I think.
Well, I think by sharing this book, sharing your story, your insights with the world, I mean, you are helping. I think that this does help. I too believe that people can be moved to change if they understand the consequences of their I don't even want to call it inhumanity, but the consequences of their uncaring behavior. And if we really knew how we treated people or how people were treated in our name, I believe that the vast majority of people would change. You mentioned that the Southern Poverty Law Center is moving towards creating an inclusive, multiracial democracy. That will take all of us, right? You talk about our habit of othering people, and it's that kind of thing that keeps us, quite frankly, from achieving that multiracial, inclusive democracy. What would you offer in terms of direction and turning us back to a more hopeful direction, away from othering and more into compassion?
Yeah, when you speak of othering, when we were talking about earlier about doing public advocacy in the media and the press, trying to share stories and change the public opinion against this policy. And I remember having conversations in June of 2018. There's got to be one of these Border Patrol agents. Somebody's going to have a conscience, and they're going to leak a photo of the detention facility or a video or something. Even if they risk their livelihood, their job by doing that, somebody's going to do it. And that's what's going to do it, right? And eventually, what leaked was not a photo or a video, but an audio. And some of you might have heard it. ProPublica and another outlet leaked it. It's about 8 minutes long, and all you hear for those 8 minutes is little children crying, crying for papi and for mommy nonstop. They're mostly girls, and they're crying and crying. And it's very painful to listen to. That audio leaked on a Monday night, and by Wednesday afternoon, less than 48 hours later, the president had signed an executive order purporting to stop the separations.
This is exactly what I mean. Yeah.
I'm convinced that the reason that audio was so powerful and so effective in changing public opinion is because when you hear children cry, you don't see the color of their skin. And all children cry the same. You think of your own children, or if you don't have children, you think of yourself when you were a child, and it's so much harder to other them.
Yes.
And it's gotten me thinking, what are these artificial things that we become so acculturated to giving such significance, like place of birth, like skin color, like language, that prevent us from feeling empathy and compassion for our fellow human beings, right? So it's when we connect at that human level and we see other persons like us, not like others, that we're able to transcend, I think, and feel that compassion. And at that point, even people who had been defending the policy, blaming their parents for the separations, when they heard it, when they heard what the policy sounded like, that was too much. And public opinion turned against the policy, and that's what did it.
Thank you. Thank you. I do remember that recording, and you're absolutely right. It was very powerful and did seem to shake us into to our senses. We're almost out of time. I did want to give you an opportunity to share about your current work as SPLC's Deputy Legal Director in Immigrant Justice. Tell us about your work and your goals with that project.
Yeah, we have a team across 5 states in the Deep South working to end immigrant detention. There's absolutely no reason that we should be putting people behind bars based on their immigration status. It's just, there's no public policy that would justify that. And we do it only because it's a money-making machine, and private detention companies make millions of dollars a year with incentives to detain immigrants for as long as possible and as many of them as possible. So we represent immigrants in detention in Georgia and Louisiana in particular, and advocate and litigate to end immigrant detention. We also work on behalf of immigrant workers, migrant workers throughout the South in a variety of industries who are often, subjected to abuses and all face retaliation from their employers if they complain based on their immigration status. And we also work on behalf of asylum seekers, people trying to apply to just be protected, just to not be sent back to death and violence. And the vision for the work, from my perspective, is that if we got rid of discrimination on the basis of immigration status, all of our issues would pretty much be solved. Now, that's difficult, right? Because discrimination on the basis of immigration status is legal in this country. The Supreme Court has upheld it. But if you believe in human rights, where you were born shouldn't matter that much, shouldn't determine how you fare in our society. So that's the work we do with a fantastic team, like I said, across states in the Deep South. And the challenges we face are difficult, are high, but I am happy to be here and doing this work at SPLC. I think we have a unique opportunity to dream big, to do the daily work, but keep our eye on the prize of really affecting change, thinking outside the box, to use a cliche, but shoot high, aim high. So I'm excited to keep doing that work on behalf of immigrants.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone on your team. I'm working hard every day and just managing the trauma that you mentioned, just heartbreaking stories. Before we break, though, I want you to share with the folks how you came about the title, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, and if you would just grant us a couple more words from your book, that would be great.
Yes, the very first day that I went to court to interview the parents, as I said, it was very quick interviews, but I want to read a brief excerpt from one of those conversations with one of the parents. It was our paralegal and she was interviewing one of the moms and I was interviewing one of the dads. I was speaking to Leonel, who was also from Guatemala. He was less than a year younger than me and wore a plaid short-sleeve shirt, white with dark and light blue lines, and cowboy-style buttons, the kind you snap together. He must have been no taller than 5 feet 7 inches. In broken Spanish, he explained that he had come with his 11-year-old son, Daniel. Like Viviana and Sandro, another family, they were traveling alone, and they were inseparable. He and Daniel were both first-time crossers and had no family in the United States. They were hoping to apply for asylum due to the persecution they had faced in their indigenous village. I got all the critical information from Leonel, but I still couldn't believe that the agents had not given him any information about his son, where he was being taken, or who would take care of him. Surely the agents must have told him something about the process and about what to expect, I thought. What do you think would happen, I asked Leonel, if you are deported and your son doesn't go with you, if he stays here? He looked down, as if thinking about it, and when he looked up, he shook his head. His look was one of resignation. No pues, mi niño se muere de tristeza. My boy will die of sorrow. For a second, my eyes didn't leave his. I struggled to write down what he was telling me. I pursed my lips and looked down, swallowed hard, and couldn't find words to respond. That conversation is where the title of the book comes from, and it's really meaningful to me that the title is not even my voice, but the voice of one of the impacted parents.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Efrén. Thank you. So Efrén is going to sign some, autograph some books for you, and you can, everyone can kind of come this way if you'd like to get a book autographed. They're also available in the lobby. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Efrén.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry that it was such a downer.
No.
Thank you so much.